From a very early age, Ben Oofana was drawn to indigenous cultures and their spiritual practices. He was particularly fascinated by the paranormal, and by the age of 12, Ben was reading everything he could find out about tribal cultures. Around the age of 14, Ben began to learn of the traditional, medicinal, psychological, and spiritual practices of a number of different North American tribes. Ben then decided that if he ever found the opportunity, he would train under a traditional American Indian doctor. And while still in high school, at the age of 17, he decided to live among the people he loved and admired, and moved to a community of predominantly Kiowa and Kiowa Apache Indians. During this time, Ben immersed himself completely in the culture and participated in the tribal dances and spiritual and healing ceremonies. It was there that Ben met his mentor, the last surviving traditional Kiowa or medicine man. After a succession of destructive relationships in his mid-20s, Ben realized that he was reenacting the traumas of his childhood and adolescence. He began developing an entire series of intensive healing methods to create more meaningful and fulfilling relationships. Welcome to our show, Ben.
Hey, thank you, Reino, for bringing me on today.
Ben, take us through what, in your opinion, makes our modern relationships so complex.
I think a lot of it, originally it stems from aspects of our parenting and our upbringing. And in saying that, I do want to mention that for the most part, our parents are doing the best they can with the resources and understanding that they possess. I mean, again, for the most part, they deeply love us and they're giving their best. And yet, our parents as well, they carry emotional wounding that's passed down through generations or from their own parenting, their own upbringing. So in many instances, there are deficits that they struggle with. And so even the parents who are giving their absolute best, in many instances, they don't necessarily have the capacity to be fully present, to fully address our needs and stuff. And all families have varying forms of dysfunction. And then there are those of us who have suffered physical, emotional, childhood sexual abuse, or some combination thereof. And as a result, we struggle to a much greater degree. Now we're all adults, so it's our responsibility as we grow into adults. And none of us are, it's never a perfect world. There are always challenges. And it's important that we look at it from the standpoint of like, okay, so we have these challenges. And so it's up to us now, even if we come from a background where there is trauma, it's our responsibility now. It's up to us to find the ways, the means to facilitate our healing. But the fact that much of the population is not what you refer to as growth oriented, there's not that willingness, that desire, that impetus to take the steps necessary to heal our emotional wounding. And a lot of people just want to be comfortable. And if something is unpleasant or difficult, causes pain, distress, lacking the understanding, many people just run from it. Or maybe there is a mentality or mindset of like, I don't want to deal with that. I don't want to look. I don't want to go there. But it's so crucial to the best of our ability. Like, for instance, when I was found myself reenacting those traumas from my own childhood and adolescence. I fought it. I resisted it for the longest time, not knowing any better. I didn't have anyone to connect the dots for me or to explain to me what I was doing or what I needed to do. But somehow intuitively, I figured out like I needed to embrace what was happening, say, oh, okay, this is my life lesson. This is what I'm here to learn.
Mm.
And just face it, deal with it, to the
Yeah.
best of my ability.
Yeah. Yeah, I had an expert here just the other day who said that we tend to fall into relationships based on the patterns we know from our childhood.
True. To a large extent, yes.
And just going back to your Indian mentors, how does their training differ from conventional modern psychology?
Wow. There are ways in which these ancient traditions, in this case, learning from a traditional native doctor, is that in some respects, there was a lack of understanding of some of the, I guess, what you would refer to as psychopathology, some of the aspects of emotional wounding. My mentor, Horace, was extraordinarily powerful, gifted, especially when it came to treating physiological, uh, health challenges that people would come to him that were suffering from cancer, leukemia. People had gone through the conventional medical route. Some were not expected to live even, and they had exhausted all possibilities as far as the modern allopathic realm. And yet they would seek out Horace, his intervention, and in so many instances, these people would heal. Uh, and Horace, he grew up, I think it was in the 1920s or so. So I'm dating myself too, as I mentioned that. He apprenticed for a short time with his father, and soon thereafter, in fact, that he was served in World War II, and so he fought in Europe. And to the day he died, he still had um, flecks of German shrapnel in his back that
Oh,
hadn't been extracted and that he was still carrying there. And so he had a limited time, from my understanding, for his own apprenticeship. But, with his own training, his father had transmitted portions of that power, that medicine to him. And so he'd go through the vision quest. But despite the fact that Horace was so extraordinarily powerful, and I've had the opportunity to work with a number of exceptionally gifted healers, I have yet to find anyone who was as powerful as he was in his day. And yet he didn't himself understand the emotional components so well. He didn't understand how to deal with his own emotional wounding, even though he was so incredibly gifted when it came to treating the physical. And so the first couple of years, Al was really amazing. But in the final years, so he was, what happens is when you possess power of that magnitude, and the power itself is impartial, and it will filter through whatever you're holding within your body and mind, within your psyche. And so there are ways in which it was like being in day and night simultaneously. There was this chaos on one hand, and on the other, this string of miracles. I mean, the results of the healing you facilitated was absolutely miraculous.
Mm.
Now, you see it too in other spiritual traditions, like in present day India, for instance. In times past, you have these Hindu Vedic traditions, you have these individuals, these yogis, sadhus, gurus that, some of them, many possess these extraordinarily gifts, capabilities, power. And in times past as well, we didn't have all this distraction. There
Mm.
wasn't all the social media and all this other distractive technology and its barrage of input flooding in through our sensory
Mm.
channels.
Mm.
And and then years and years ago, there were many such individuals who devoted their lives to this discipline and just hours of intensive daily training. And yes, they would have some following, but it wasn't these massive hordes of people. And I mean, these days you go to see some of the gurus and it's like a circus at times, because there's all this kind of childlike blind devotion, and you see the acting out, the crazy ass dysfunction. And I've gone sometimes, and you could feel this kind of light glowy presence, but I could also feel all the shit that's coming out of people's bodies,
Yeah.
the stuff that they're not necessarily
Mm.
dealing with, and they're like all kind of blissed out, and all the stuff that's releasing from their bodies also floating in the air. I'm just
Mm.
very empathic, so I see it and I feel it.
Yeah.
And but it ties in a way. I didn't fully finish what I was starting a while ago, which I'll go back to, but a lot of people, and my mentor, he taught me a lesson that he never intended to teach me, is that the importance of learning to work constructively with our emotions. And whether it's within those of us training in some ancient spiritual discipline, people just living in the modern day world in whatever realm, even if they're excelling in, they're building a startup or just uh, any field or profession or any aspect of life. And there's just so many of us, we haven't learned to work constructively with our emotions.
Mm.
In my case, because see, when my mentor Horace, when he transmitted that power, these gifts of healing, what they refer to as medicine, initially he would do those transmissions, and he'd have someone standing behind me to catch me, because the impact of that was so great, it would physically knock me unconscious
Mm.
momentarily.
Mm.
And gradually began to have me assist him in the work he did with people. And I remember one of the first times he did so, and there's a man who was seriously injured when a piece of heavy equipment, I think either a bulldozer, front end loader or something, turned over. He was pinned underneath. So he was left paralyzed from the waist down, and he had blood clots forming in his leg. And so a lot of the native doctors years ago, sometimes they would just use their mouth to the flesh, or take a buffalo horn, the end of it, where they'd cut the tip off, and part of it's hollow, and they'd stick it to the flesh and maybe little scratches or
Mm.
something. And literally, they can do things like if someone had pneumonia, they could pull that fluid out of the body.
Mm.
If someone had, like in this case, the blood clots, and when the blood clots came out of the back of this man's leg, and I was just absolutely in shock. It's like, like it worked. It actually, here they came out, and after apprenticing, for you know over 2 years with Horace, I put myself back in college. I was still apprenticing for a
Mm.
while, but I needed time to put my head back together. And after all the intense, uh, I mean, he would do things like at one point he dumped me off in the middle of the Hopi Indian reservation, said, hitchhike to Las Vegas, Nevada, make it the best you can. So it's like forcing me to learn to rely on my instincts in
Mm,
order to survive. But I'd gone through so much, and he, like I said, he's transmitting portions of that power to me and driving all over the southwestern part of the United States, a lot of times not getting a lot of sleep. And it was very intense. But so I'm in college and, enjoying, that time. But as my student getting close to graduation and realizing it's like, hey, student loan or student financial aid is running out. I actually have to start working with people and get serious here.
mm,
And as I did, it was like pouring hydrogen peroxide into an infected wound because a lot of the traumas of my past that I carried before, where I was very numb or dissociated, and all that starts flooding out. And I found myself reenacting it in my attempts to form romantic or intimate relationships. And mainly forming attachments to women who were either unavailable or disinterested,
mm,
and some were quite abusive.
mm,
But that was uh, eliciting this like at times excruciating pain. I was
mm,
just consumed with that pain,
mm,
but somehow instinctively, I I knew to dive into the depths of it, and I would
mm,
just breathe very softly, very deeply, sometimes for hours on end. But at a certain point, I could feel it break open and come
mm,
out of my body in waves. I did go through psychotherapy for a few years, and for many of us, it's a valuable resource. It's an important part of our healing
mm,
process. I gained the cognitive understanding of my emotional wounding, but it wasn't actually healing the trauma itself.
mm,
But developing this practice, which led to the development of a whole series of intensive meditation
mm,
practices, was crucial for it started breaking down in a lot of these deeply entrenched patterns. It helped me to
mm,
start processing or digesting that backlog of painful emotion that I stored, from much of the past trauma. And that's often the driving force that causes us to form these attachments to individuals that are not a good match for us,
mm,
that
mm,
can be, in some instances, abusive. And when we hold all that emotion in our body, we're not processing it. That makes it extraordinarily difficult for us to let go.
mm,
The more we can drop into those emotions, process, literally digest it, and then it enables us to dissolve those
mm,
unhealthy
mm,
attachments.
mm,
So, very crucial part of our healing, that the fact that many people have not learned to work constructively with their emotions, they keep reenacting a
mm.
lot of these deeply wounding experiences,
Mm.
reenacting the past
Yeah,
traumas and other
yeah.
dysfunction.
Yeah, a lot of the traditional cultures emphasize this transmutation of emotions, controlling and steering and managing your emotions, which of course are often originating from past trauma. Now, you had the combination of obviously both Western and ancient healing traditions. Uh, where is your emphasis at the moment?
Both.
So you wouldn't say either or.
It's important to combine again, you know, some of Freud's ideas were a little bizarre, but with Carl Jung and
Mm,
a number of the other individuals, the within the modern psychotherapeutic, there's tremendous insight and understanding of our emotional wounding, of the pathology, the psychopathology that many of us carry. And again, much of this was lacking in some of the ancient traditional cultures. They understood it from a certain vantage point, and there are ways in which, say, for instance, a big part of my training, when my mentor Horace transmitted portions of his own healing gifts in order to earn the right to work with those gifts of healing. You go through the vision quest, which is typically 4 days and nights alone in the mountains, no food and no water. I've gone dozens of times. What was it? Just over 4 weeks ago, I came down from the mountain, and that was my 60-second time to go through the vision quest. It's just,
Yeah.
for me, not about impressing anyone. It's just when you train in these traditions, you just keep going.
Mm.
If you're
Mm.
committed, if you're serious. And there are times I've been on the mountain and I'd feel this extraordinarily powerful presence descend into my body. And it would be like a near-death experience. There are many instances where I would have some traumatic events, many of
Mm.
which I had either a vague recollection or just no memory
Mm.
at all. And it all comes flooding back. I'm reliving that experience, whatever was taking place at those during that time, what I was thinking, all the vivid emotions and sensations, everything, it's all flooding back. And as that happens, I can feel that presence, that power, those that forces that have descended into my body. They're transmuting that all the impressions of that lived experience that
Mm.
I hold within my body, the emotions, all that, and so that I can digest it.
Mm.
It needs to be digested
Mm.
like the food we
Yeah.
eat.
Yeah. And
And
there's so much truth to the saying, nature is one of our best healers. And you having immersed yourself so much in the Indian culture, obviously you have taken up a lot of that.
mhm, yeah, but then too, like there were periods where I was just reading, volumes of clinical psych, just to understand, the fact that I came from a background and suffered a great deal of trauma. And then it was in like my latter 20s when I started having a lot of individuals come to me, mostly women, with histories of childhood sexual trauma. And I had very little understanding of what I was dealing with initially with these individuals. And so I had to learn. I needed
Mm.
to understand, get an in-depth understanding. And so over the years, I've worked with many individuals,
Mhm.
and now you mentioned too, like, in many instances, the fact that we're reenacting the dysfunction of our childhood and adolescence. And yet, as we come of age, grow into our teens and 20s, and we can also be extraordinarily naive, that we lack understanding. And I think it's something like around 15% of the population might fall into what could be described as cluster B personality disorders, which would include borderline and
Mm.
narcissism. Maybe sociopathy would be thrown into that mix. And so being so vulnerable, lacking understanding, we can easily fall into a relationship with such an individual, form attachment
Mhm.
to someone with these traits or characteristics. And to be in a relationship with someone like that, it, it can it can be extraordinarily wounding.
Mhm.
And the fact that, being that we don't understand what we're dealing with, and when we go through such a painful experience, in this case, a relationship, and when the person is saying and doing things that are so incredibly hurtful. We don't know how to deal with
mm,
what's taking place. We don't know how to work with our emotions. The way that we suppress, we disconnect, we deny what's happening, we numb ourselves out, we distract ourselves. But the danger in doing so is that we internalize that the abuses we suffer, we internalize those deeply hurtful experiences.
mm,
And so as that happens, there's a way in which our psyche is, or our subconscious is wanting to come to some kind of resolution. So
mm,
what we tend to do is it establishes a pattern there, and we attract more individuals who continue to reenact that pattern. So
mm,
even if we have parents who are initially very loving, supportive, very nurturing, we have, a good foundation, so to speak, we could still be fairly vulnerable. I've seen that happen to a number of individuals,
mm,
that despite the fact that they had a good foundation, one of those early relationships or attachments that they established, they got their heart ripped out.
mm, mm,
And so then that started this pattern that they began to play out in subsequent relationships.
mhm. Why do people stay in dysfunctional relationships for so long?
Again, a big part of it, which I mentioned earlier, is the fact that one, we lack understanding. I mean, to a large extent, we have a gross lack of understanding of the our own emotional wounding or that of others, of psychopathology. I mean, I I'm probably going to offend some people, and part of me is to a point where I don't care, because it's but you look at what's happening in the United States right now. I mean, the fact that the previous election, about 70 million people voted for a malignant narcissist, an absolute sociopath. And he's one of the, Trump, one of the leading presidential candidates, you know, who heavily leans, has those autocratic tendencies, and it's dangerous, and the fact that people are so grossly ignorant,
Mm,
it's like, and I'll come back around. I'm diverging a little bit, but you look at, there's an excellent book, Strong Men from Mussolini to the Present by
mm,
Ruth Ben-Ghiat. Um, Other books like Twilight for Democracy,
mm,
Annie Applebaum. And last year, listening to a biography of Joseph Stalin in the Holodomor, which was under Stalin's policy. I think they created this artificial famine. I think it was about 10 million Ukrainians that were starved to death.
mm, mm,
And you see what Putin is enacting, and the disinformation stuff. And yet, there's such a large percentage of our population that is just, I mean, it reminds me when I was growing up, the band the Sex Pistols, and they had that song Pretty Vacant.
yeah,
And there's
yeah.
just a way that a lot of people are just so checked out,
Mm.
just not paying attention. And, you
Being
know, uh,
being programmed by propaganda. Um,
yeah,
and
easily manipulated.
yeah, yeah. I
Yeah,
just delved into this in my recent blog. There's been so much research on the psychology of dictators, and you look
yeah.
at all of them, Adolf Hitler,
Mhm, mhm,
Putin, Mao
mhm,
Zedong,
mhm.
Stalin, come from abusive childhoods.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And this whole thing, as I said before, our tendency to not want to feel, to disconnect emotionally. We
Mm,
don't go there.
mhm,
We need to teach ourselves. It's so critically important, because when we deny, when we suppress,
mhm,
when we distract ourselves, we're disconnecting from the larger part of our being.
Yeah.
And
And then we go into projection. It's the immigrants, it's the minorities, it's the gays, it's whatever,
mhm,
who are responsible for my unhappiness and my resentment.
right, right. And so, and when we disconnect from our own emotional wounding and we hold that pain,
Mm,
grief, sadness, the anger, the rage, this whole range of emotion, whatever we're numbing or disconnecting from, we hold that in our bodies.
yeah.
And we all have a responsibility. You know,
Mm,
we are all part of the greater whole. And so
yeah.
as we disconnect and we hold that pain and that emotional wounding within our bodies, that feeds into the global collective. And so it manifests as the destruction of the planet,
Mm,
the abuses that are
mm,
perpetrated towards children,
mm,
animals. I mean, you look at what's happening. Another example, say with dogs or cats. You know,
yeah.
many of
Yeah.
us we love our pets,
Mm,
but there's this massive disconnect. We're just breeding, you
mm,
know, all these pedigree pups,
mm,
and and in doing so, it's creating this overpopulation of dogs, and and yet millions of dogs end up in shelters. And I think, God, I forget how many thousands. I think it's something like about 77,000 or so dogs are euthanized every year.
mm,
But it's just this, there's a way in which so many of us are so disconnected that we lack empathy. And so
mm,
when we're shutting down our emotions, we're numbing and we're suppressing ourselves. And we hold all this toxicity in our body, the emotions that we
mm,
disconnect from, that we numb, that we suppress, we hold that in our bodies. And, you know, in our society, well, spiritually, there's this thing about coming from the heart, being
mm,
loving,
mm,
but a lot of it's very shallow. It's very
mm,
superficial. There are ways in which many of us, we inhabit our bodies from the diaphragm up. But as I work with a lot of people, what I find is that below the diaphragm, that abdominal region, it holds a great deal of stagnation. We hold a lot of the emotion that we numb ourselves to. We go through a breakup or divorce, we get
mm,
jerked around, and we numb ourselves to that pain, and it creates layers of armoring or deadness over the heart. It
mm,
restricts our capacity,
mm,
diminishes our capacity to love and be loved.
mm,
And also, that's a big part of we're not processing those emotions. It keeps us locked into those holding patterns so that we continue to hold on to that person, even though it causes us pain, even though the
mm,
relationship is hugely dysfunctional. We don't learn, we don't grow, we don't evolve, and we stay in that same level of
mm,
dysfunction.
mm,
Now, but in addition, okay, there's a lot of this emotion that we hold in our chest cavity and other parts of our body, but below the diaphragm, there's a larger accumulation. And much of that, it turns into like our own little toxic waste dump.
mm, mhm,
And so you see people, they're getting these huge bellies.
mhm,
And my intention is not to fat shame. I want to
mhm,
be empathetic to everyone. But it does contribute to additional weight as well because we hold all this emotion and it impacts our digestion. And sometimes we hold this emotional wounding or
mm,
trauma, and we need these additional layers, this additional layering to insulate ourselves, to
yeah.
buffer ourselves. There are many ways, you know,
Mhm.
additional weight is just many ways. A lot of people, the weight is,
Also caused by stress. We know that from
yeah.
research. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say the weight is just one aspect, but
Mm,
it's something that's visually apparent
mm,
outwardly.
mm,
But you have other people who buffer through smoking or drinking and other recreational drugs, but or whatever crazy ass dysfunction they're acting out. You know, there's all kinds of ways that we numb or disconnect.
mm,
And but in doing so, we hold all this stress, this emotional wounding, and and much of what we hold in our abdominal region, again, it becomes like this, there's this thickness, this deadness with a
mm,
lot of people down in this region, all
mm,
this stagnation, armoring. but what we hold there, that's reflected in the world around us. You see, again, the destruction of the planet, uh, war, the abuses that are perpetrated,
Mm.
other forms of violence and dysfunction. So, individually and collectively, it helps to maintain the holding patterns that keep us from evolving, healing, and transforming
Yeah.
ourselves in our relationships and the
Mm.
planet as a whole from becoming kinder, more compassionate, more empathetic.
Yeah. One of the spiritual teachers, I don't know who it was, I think it was a Buddhist teacher, said that you diminish negativity and darkness by going into your heart and kindness, which makes sense if I hear what you just said.
To some extent, I think there's, what I have found with a lot of Buddhist traditions is that they sometimes there's this like observe the emotion and there's this more kind of detachment, but they're not as subjectively immersing themselves in the emotion to thoroughly digest it.
Mm.
For me, from my standpoint, I feel it's important to be subjective, to be immersed in that emotion.
Mm.
Now, I hear, there's different perspectives or a different approach depending on what Buddhist teaching or lineage that you follow or that you adhere to. But I've worked with a lot of people who have done the more mindfulness practices that are being taught. And
Mm.
it's like the emotion, it's like watching the bear walk through the woods, when the bear is over there and you're back here somewhere. And it's
Yeah.
like, and
Yeah.
I tell people, it's like, no, get your ass in the middle of
Yeah.
those emotions,
Yeah.
feel it,
Yeah.
fully feel it.
Yeah, which you have a lot in the Indian traditions. If you look at their dances and their singing and their very vibrant way of practicing their rituals.
Yeah, even then, I have to think uh, every culture has its, is it okay to use a little language here?
Yeah, go
Just to drive a
ahead.
point home. Every culture has its own brand of fucked upness. It's its own flavor of psychopathology.
Yeah.
There's among Native Americans, one of the biggest drawbacks, and there were on one hand, there is they had developed to such a level spiritually, and they were so connected to the earth, but the warfare between tribes, and that was also played a big part in their demise. I'd say more
Mm.
than anything else was the impact of the diseases brought over by Europeans, Native Americans not having domesticated animals as Europeans and Asians and Africans and Middle Easterners had sheep, pigs, horses. Well, yeah, they didn't have horses either.
Mm.
The only thing they had is the dog, and in Central and South America, well, actually South America, the llama and the alpaca. And so because of that, they see a lot of these diseases are zoonotic in origin.
Mm.
They jump the species barriers. Um, and maybe I'm being a little graphic, but was it those guys in Italy, porking sheep or something like
Mm.
that,
Mhm.
syphilis or whatever. Um, there is smallpox, a lot of these diseases, I believe. Um, I'm not sure about smallpox, but I know a lot of diseases are zoonotic in origin. They jump from animal to human, but native, the indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere, not having domesticated animals, lacked the immunity, and so it wiped out when smallpox, cholera, measles came over to the Americas. It just obliterated um, tribes of people. I mean, there
Mm.
would just be just like the Mandans and the Pawnees, some like 25, 30,000 people. And after the smallpox and measles, cholera, it was something like maybe 100 to 900 people survived from 25 to 30,000. So just mass die-off. It was just horrific what was happening. But another factor, what I was saying is that the warfare among the Native American tribes was horrific, and they would just massacre members of the other tribes. They would just go in and, there was an incident where the Osage warriors came down. I mean, they had to travel for days.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, I don't know if it was on foot or horseback. Probably, I think they had horses by the 1830s. But they traveled to southwestern Oklahoma and they massacred a whole group of Kiowas. And they, I'm being a little graphic, but they cut their heads off and they put their heads in copper pots. The men were out hunting, and so it was just women, children, and old people. And it's like, and it's referred to as Cutthroat Gap,
Mm-hmm.
so, and a lot of Kiowas never, for generations, never forgave the Osage for that
Mm-hmm.
reason.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of tribes were committing these atrocities, so there was the downside as far as the warfare. And so again, the fact that in so many traditions, like you look in India, for instance, and there is this tremendous development spiritually. You have these individuals, these gurus and yogis that
Mm-hmm.
had attained such high levels of development. And yet, on the other hand, there's a caste system,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and
Yeah.
it's like being that you come from South Africa and you're well aware of the system of apartheid,
Mm-hmm.
the racism and the violence and discrimination, the horrors that these people, imprisonment that these uh, Native African people
Mm-hmm.
were subjected to, you're well aware, that's another reflection of this wounding that manifests individually and collectively in
Mm-hmm.
society. And so, uh, and in India, with the caste system, and you have this large segment of the population that is subjected to a lot of they're relegated to the lowest of occupations with the manual scavenging, which is
Mm-hmm.
going and cleaning up the excrement
Yeah.
of other people, just doing other work that is considered beneath anyone
Mm-hmm.
else. The the lower castes are referred to as Dalits,
Yeah, yeah,
and
it's a form of apartheid, no doubt. Yeah.
it is.
Yeah.
And then you have instances where, like the Dalit women, in many instances, would be sexually assaulted with impunity. There is no punishment toward the perpetrator of those abuses.
Mm.
So even when in different cultures or societies where people had developed spiritually, a lot of times there's this very pernicious, very destructive shadow aspect.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's one of the reasons, in addition to doing your spiritual practice in developing one's body and mind, I strongly emphasize the importance, and this is where the modern psychological understanding comes in and
Mm-hmm.
plays an important part, is doing the deep emotional work to heal these parts of ourselves that are wounded, because only when we do so do we develop compassion and
Mm-hmm.
empathy,
Mm-hmm.
when we learn to relate to other people, other life, dogs,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
other animals, all other living creatures, the planet Earth itself, that we learn to relate, from a place, again, from empathy and
Mm-hmm.
compassion.
Yeah. Yeah. Ben, you have such an important message out there. How can people connect with you?
The best way to access me is through my website, benoofana.com. I'm on Facebook and Instagram and YouTube. if you're very right-wing leaning by chance, you may find what I post a bit very pro-democracy. So, but yeah, you could find me on social media. I have my own YouTube channel where I post videos. If you go to my website, benoofana.com, uh, I post a lot of articles and I post videos that I film that I post alongside the articles. And so, yeah, go to my website. There is a contact form where you can message me, uh, call the Google Voice number. If by chance you don't hear from me, just assume I didn't get the message because occasionally technology does fail. I do work with people individually. I can do phone sessions. If at all possible, work with me in person because the in-person work is exponentially more powerful. But either way, by remotely over WhatsApp or the phone or in person, I do work with people.
Yeah, Ben, I really want to acknowledge you for your great work spreading more kindness, more compassion in the world. Thank you for being on our show.
Thank you so much, Reino. Just really enjoyed our dialogue.